Generally speaking, memory tends to be encoded and retrieved in the same area that we call executive functioning or working memory. Working memory is the part of the brain that is actively working with memory. It's where we encode it, it's where we retrieve it, it's where we work with it. This used to be called short-term memory, but that term has been rejected because there's a lot more going on than just storing something temporarily till it can be stored long-term. Working memory is really our awareness. It's our executive function. It's almost our sense of self, our personal identity, our ego, right? It's where we are experiencing what's happening in the world right now, as well as being able to retrieve what's happened in our past, and we're mixing them together to make a decision, to make a judgment, to decide how we should act, to decide how we should think, to decide what's happening, right? So really, in a broad sense, our memory, our working memory, our executive function is our personal identity, our consciousness, our ego. As new information comes in, right, we often struggle to get it encoded quickly. Right? If I were to ask you to remember, 4 digits, 5, 7, 2, 1, that's not terribly difficult, right? But if I were to ask you to remember 10 digits, it becomes much harder. And if you had to remember them, what would you tend to do? Most people tend to rehearse them over and over and over again. They just say the numbers in their mind over and over and over and over and over again. Well, if we don't have rehearsal, how long can we store information in our memory? Without that constant reminder, without that ability to repeat it over and over again, it turns out that most information that comes in decays very rapidly. If you do not actively encode it and process it into storage, information will decay within seconds. Okay? That means whatever I just told you 5 minutes ago in the video is gone. Whatever I just told you 6 seconds ago is gone. Right? The only way to keep this information in our brains is through active encoding processes, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Right? We have to do things to get it into long-term storage. Right? So this sort of short-term memory is very, very, very short. What we've mostly been talking about is what we call explicit memory. Explicit memory is memory that is about the events in our life. It is the story of our life. It's the biography. It's things that have occurred, right? It's also sort of facts and things that we know. If I were to ask you, what's the first car you ever drove? You could probably tell me, right? That may or may not be related to a specific memory. Right? If I told you what year you were born, you just know that information. That's explicit, but it's also the stories, right? That for your first speeding ticket, right? The story you could tell about your first ticket is biographical memory, but it is also explicit. The key thing that binds all this is they are things that have to be actively recalled in order for them to come into memory. Or we sometimes call them declarative in the sense that they are easy to talk about. These are memories that we can talk about, that we can tell people about. We can contrast this with what we call implicit memories. Implicit memories are memories that are encoded sometimes without our awareness. They're often called non-declarative because they're difficult to talk about. For example, try to find somebody and explain to them, just using words, how to tie shoelaces. Maybe try it right now. Even if you're by yourself, just explain out loud how to tie shoelaces. Chances are you're going to really struggle to do that. Chances are if you're trying to do it, you actually have your hands up in the air and you're mimicking trying to tie the shoelaces in the air. That's because this implicit memory is non-declarative. It's something that is encoded in a different way, right? It's not explicit. It's just something that is there. Turns out that these two memory systems are very different. They are encoded anatomically different, and they are completely differentiated from each other. Explicit memories are encoded in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is not where we store explicit memories. Memories are stored throughout the cerebral cortex, but the hippocampus is where we encode explicit memories. It's not where we encode implicit memories. We know this because of certain case studies. One of the most famous case studies in all of psychology, certainly within cognitive psychology, and maybe one of the most famous case studies ever, is the case study of Henry Molaison, or HM, as is known in the literature. Because in case studies, we can only know the initials until after the person dies, and then their name is released. Henry was a young man that suffered from terrible epileptic seizures. They were intractable. They didn't respond to any treatment. They were highly debilitating. He barely graduated high school. He couldn't care for himself. He struggled to dress himself, to feed himself. He couldn't hold a job. He couldn't have a relationship. He had normal levels of intelligence, normal levels of social functioning, but these seizures were so invasive and so destructive to his life that he became desperate. There were several doctors that had seen a surgery in rats that seemed to prevent epileptic seizures. They just had to go in and remove an area of the brain where the seizures seemed to originate. Henry, desperate to get control of his epileptic seizures, signed up for this surgery. The doctors went in, removed the tissue on both sides of the brain, and he woke up. The nurses come in and greet him, and Henry wakes up and goes, "Oh, hi, nurse. My name is Henry. It's nice to meet you." And the nurse sort of introduces herself. They talk for a few seconds, and she walks out of the room, comes back in about 5 minutes later, and Henry looks up and goes, "Hi, my name is Henry. It's nice to meet you." Suddenly there's some concern. Nurse leaves the room, comes back in. Henry looks up and goes, "Hi, my name is Henry. It's nice to meet you." Turns out that the tissue that they removed was the hippocampus. Henry can no longer encode explicit memories. All of his memories of everything that happened in his life up until the point of the surgery are intact. He remembers everything, but he can no longer form new explicit memories. Right? People he worked with for the rest of his life, doctors and researchers who worked with him for decades, he never learned them. He would introduce himself every single time, never learn their names. However, the implicit memory systems were still intact. For example, they bring Henry in and they have him do something called mirror tracing, where he has to trace in a box where all he can see is a mirror image of his hand. This means that everything's kind of in reverse. It's a difficult thing to do, but people with practice can become quite good at it. Henry would have no memory of having done this before, and he would practice it, and he got very good at it. And every time they'd bring him in, he'd say, "I've never done this before." They'd explain to him how to do it, and he'd sit down and he'd do it perfectly because his implicit memory was intact. Right? He had no explicit memory of having done the task, but his motor memory was still there. Henry struggled his whole entire life with this issue. There were some really heartbreaking stories that emerged from him. For example, Henry was very close to his father, and he'd, suddenly perk up at some point in the day and go, "Man, I can't remember the last time I talked to my dad." And just would call his dad, and he'd talk to him for a while, then hang up, and a few minutes later he goes, "Man, I can't remember the last time I talked to my dad." Call his dad and talk to him for a while and hang up, and then, "I can't remember the last time I talked to my dad." And he'd, day in and day out, he'd call his dad dozens of times. Well, eventually, unfortunately, as time passes, his dad died. And Henry would say, "Man, I really want to call my dad." And the nurse would go, "Henry, I'm sorry, your dad has passed away." And he would experience that horrific, intense grief that people feel when they lose someone close to them, that awful just punch. And then it was gone. And he'd go, "I can't remember the last time I called my dad." And the nurses would have to say again, "I'm sorry, Henry, your dad died." He couldn't grieve, and he couldn't process that grief. It could never end because he always learned anew every single time that his father had passed. However, eventually, Henry stopped asking about his dad. Did he suddenly remember? Well, no. Think back to our last chapter. It turns out operant conditioning is a form of implicit memory. Henry did not learn that his dad had died in the explicit memory system, but in the implicit memory system, it learned that whenever Henry asked about his father, he experienced something terrible. So he stopped asking. They had to remove a lot of the mirrors because he'd wake up and he'd look in the mirror and there'd be an 80-year-old man looking back, but he was remembering waking up from a surgery being 24 years old. These surgeries are not the only way this can happen. Occasionally, the hippocampi will be damaged in infection, in an encephalopathy, right? In meningitis or another infection can raise the temperature so high that the hippocampi will burn out, but the rest of the brain will remain intact. This is what happened to Clive Wearing, who was a composer and pianist. who unfortunately had a meningital infection, and both his hippocampi burned out. He has the same disorder that Henry has. He can't form new explicit memories. But his implicit memories are still perfectly intact. They give him a new piece of music he's never seen before, and he has to practice it over and over again. Eventually, he becomes very good at it, but he'll have no memory of having ever played it before, of having ever heard it before. But he'll sit down and he'll play it perfectly. I think Clive can give us the closest thing we can to what this might be to experience, because he has stacks and stacks of journals. He writes in his journal day in and day out, page after page, line after line. What Clive does is he writes, I am now awake. I am awake for the first time. I am now totally awake. I am now completely awake. Over and over again, he writes the same line over and over and over again. Then he scratches it out because he doesn't remember writing it. And he writes it again, page after page, journal after journal, line after line. He's constantly experiencing this sudden wakefulness, a sudden awareness, and then it's gone. And now he's back with a new sense of awareness because he can never form these new experiences and these new memories. It's from people like Henry and people like Clive that we have learned about the explicit and the implicit systems, right? How do we get explicit memories into our long-term storage, though? We've all experienced this. The classroom studying is a prime example of this, where you'll listen to me talk, you'll read your textbook, and it all seems to make sense, and then you sit down to take the exam, and you're like, I don't remember any of this, right? Things just don't happen through pure osmosis. You can't just absorb information. In order to get it into long-term memory, encoded in a form that is retrievable, we have to apply strategies.